Spiritual Christianity, Chapter 5, continued. Point number 65. Accordingly, he proceeds to show the way in which the sensuous images are conveyed from their external causes to the mind. Waves of light, odorous particles, and the atmosphere thrown into a state of undulatory vibration are all assumed to pass from their material causes and to impinge on the termination of those nerves which, by their structure, are calculated to convey the particular impressions to the brain, this being either the material organ of the mind or else identical with the mind itself. In all this process for the production of sensation, there appears such a show of reason that no materialist ever dreams of the fallacy that lies at the foundation of the whole. So specious is it that the important question is overlooked: how the mind is to pass into the space of the external world and to trace the cause of these vibrating or fluctuating atoms from the material sources of sensation. The mind is only cognizant of the supposed results. Its external world, its space, its atmospheric media, its nerves, its brain are as sensations, nothing more than effects, the physical causes of which the mind may suppose, but can never be perceived by the senses themselves. It deludes itself when it thinks that the whole process of transmission is revealed in the sensation. The cause which it is searching after is not at all revealed in it, and never can be so revealed. We may think that we see the sun's rays pass, either directly or indirectly, from that body to our eyes, and we may also think that the optic nerve is a fit vehicle for conveying the rays of light into the brain. But it might well be as to consider what it is we are actually dealing with while we are talking thus confidently of the sun and of its rays being transmitted to us through space. We are dealing with sensations, and with nothing else, and cannot by the sensations themselves discover whether they have spiritual or material causes, whether the influx, which in the sensuous images looks as if it were physical, be real or not, or whether it actually be such as it appears to be. Point number 66. But from this series of shadows, which have no other substration than what the imagination assigns to them, the natural man derives his belief that the whole process of mental development is physical also. As sensations are the effects of their physical causes, thoughts, desires, and propensities are in turn assumed to be the effects of sensations. In this way, the internal conscious life is made to depend upon the lifeless atoms for its existence, and when the mind is so deeply sunk in naturalism as to see nothing but time, space, and matter in its own operations, it does not hesitate, notwithstanding the absurdity, to attribute its very thoughts and affections to a secreting process carried on in the different convolutions of the brain. Point number 67. After some such a manner, by an influx strictly physical, are mind and body with all their phenomena accounted for, by him who consistently follows out his own speculations according to what he considers the true or inductive method of reasoning. An extraneous and independent space and time lead necessarily to a belief of the influx of subtle elements which convey the images of outward things to the different senses, and so onward to the brain. The impressions of sensuous images give birth to thoughts, affections, and desires, and all these, as they depend for their existence on the configuration of the brain, increasing by its development and decaying with its decay, are eliminated from its glandular forms by a process which must be very analogous to the secretion of tears and saliva by the lacrimal and salivary glands. With such opinions, it is quite consistent that man should be the creature of circumstances, and instead of what spiritual truth teaches, a mediatory cause for the production of events which represent specific affinities and oppositions of mental states and changes in the sphere of life, must be a mere effect, and as much controlled and determined by changes in the material world, as the bodily structure by the peculiar arrangement of matter that enters into its composition. Point number 68. He who pursues these tendencies of his natural mind ends in becoming a slave to the fallacies of sensual thought. And when once these fallacies are confirmed by a course of inductive reasoning, however easy the descent, it is difficult indeed for him to retrace his steps. Every fact which the senses present, and which is accounted for after a natural manner, strengthens the delusion. Man is not a spiritual being whose will and thought are the substances which give birth to and support the phenomena of outward life, but is a wonderful mass of organised matter. The highest as well as the lowest faculties of his mind are the products of certain material configuration, and his very consciousness is a consciousness belonging to the conglomeraries of atoms of which his body is composed. How strange! How marvellous and incomprehensible! That myriads of atoms, individually devoid of sense and motion, should, when organically arranged, straightway become a being imbued with thoughts, feelings, sense, and motion, a being who loses not his individual consciousness, although the atoms themselves are continually changing to be replaced by fresh materials. Point number 69. Of a similar kind are the views of the natural philosophist in respect to the creation of the world. As the phenomena of life, according to the conclusions to which the direct evidence of his senses conducts him, are the effects of certain curious combinations and consequent activities of matter, just as mind is supposed to be the result of sensation, and sensation to depend upon the transference of images of the external or natural world through different media to the brain, it seems to follow plainly that the materials out of which man was to be originally fashioned, from the organizations of which the mind was to exist, by the growth of which the mind was to grow, and with the decay of which the mind was to decay, must have been created before the man himself. Accordingly, in the theory of the naturalist, a world is first of all formed out of a chaos of atoms, by a God who works either mechanically or chemically in a spatial universe. A material universe, having been created, then will follow, in a long chain of causes and effects, the organic forms of the mind, which being themselves material, are connected with the material world by the various images of the senses. In these views of the naturalist, it is plain that matter must have been created before the living conscious being. For whether the body be an instrument for the natural operations of the mind, or whether the latter be nothing more than a subtle secretion from the former, it is evident, equally in either case, that matter must have been created, or have existed before the body could have been constructed, and that without a world there could have been no objects of sensation, that these could not have been conveyed to the mind without material nerves, nor be the objects of thought without a material brain. It is never for a moment doubted, therefore, that the material world was created and brought into a condition fit for habitation before the creation of living conscious beings, whether brute animals or men. Atoms, in themselves dead, will, in the theories of the naturalist, become, by some strange course of condensation and combination, the various forms of the mineral kingdom. From these would be produced, possibly at long intervals, the living effects of those more elaborate combinations which belong to the vegetable and animal kingdom. His reasons for believing that some such process as was this pursued by the Creator will be greatly strengthened and perhaps confirmed by the examination which have been made of late years into the superficial strata of the earth, which seems to prove so completely and satisfactorily that the earth must have remained for ages uninhabited by sentient or by thinking beings, and that it must have passed through a multitude of changes before it was fitted either to be united to mind or to be the causal ground of its existence. Point number 70. Opinions such as these, only more or less chemical or mechanical in their character, according to the various pursuits and tendencies of men, the natural mind of everyone who is interested in these subjects will adopt as his theory of creation. As he looks abroad day by day, he will be strengthened in the belief that he sees and feels the matter itself which fills the void of space of the natural world, as well as those subtle fluids which are the supposed media for the transmission of its images. All that he sees and feels and hears and smells and tastes appears to be distinct from himself and his bodily senses, and therefore he concludes that they are so. And as he disconnects the matter itself from man, he is of necessity obliged to connect it with God as its all-pervading and co-enduring cause. These are the conclusions to which his naturalism will lead him. He will have a deity in all space, and who is himself extended through space, who is in all time and whose life is progressive, or who is omnipresent in the space of nature, and who is co-enduring with the forms of matter. It makes no difference whatever to say that he feels infinite space. Mind cannot feel space, because there is no ratio between mind and the hypothetical matter of the natural man. They are unalike in kind, and it can be absurd to apply a natural impletion to mind which can be said only metaphorically to fill. It lessens not the difficulty to say that he endures from eternity to eternity. Progression of life, which is implied by the expression from eternity to eternity, necessarily supposes another creator, the idea of whose life involves not the absurdity of a continued self-creation, but who, being perfect, can have no changes whatever on which the sense of vital progression or of time depends. Point number 71. If we now turn to the truth which angels and spiritual beings perceive in reference to the creation of their outward representative world, we find as a condition for such a spiritual perception that though spaces and times, with the visible, the tangible, and the sensuous forms generally, which the natural man attributes to matter, remain as objects of thought, just the same as before, being the basis on which the mind rests, in the purest and most perfect abstractions of which it is capable, they are not the subjects of thought as they are with man. In this consists the difference between the two, and as it will be shown hereafter, these two modes of thinking are actually the barriers, and the only barriers, which separate the spiritual and the natural worlds. Point number 72. But to show more distinctly what is meant by their having the sensuous appearances of space and time for the objects and not for the subjects of thought, it shall be illustrated by a few examples. A spiritual being has the like sensuous objects as a natural being. They are obvious to every one of his senses, for he sees them, he touches them, hears them, smells and tastes them. They appear to be more or less removed at different distances around him, and just as it is with a natural being, there are necessary limits to the extent of his vision. By the objects of sight he has as much the sense of distance derived from their number and the gradual diminution of their size, as well as from their tints and lights and shadows, as man has. And he has as much the sense of time or progression in the changes which these objects seem to undergo, or man has or can have. And yet they serve to convey no information to the mind connected with the laws of nature, or with anything analogous to the laws of nature, but a series of truths relating to the spiritual life. All the phenomena which impress his mind with a sense of distance and externity to himself are precisely similar to the phenomena of this world. The difference is that the angel does not think of them as things existing in a space which is independent of himself, but as effects presented to his mind of the relations of spiritual or mental spheres to one another and of all to the Lord God. The relations of these mental spheres are the subjects of his thought. Into these, by an influx of the divine life into his mind, he has an insight, more or less spontaneous according to the state of his love and wisdom, when he beholds these various objects and their relations. Their relative distances suggest to him the spiritual causes of such appearances. Every object included in the apparent distance has its spiritual cause and therefore its distinct meaning or signification. It signifies or is a representative sign of the affinity or consanguinity of some sphere or spheres, more or less spiritually remote from his own mind, and of the uses which they serve to promote in the universal angelic form of heaven. Their successive changes he refers at once and without any effort of the mind to their internal causes, for external or natural causes are the fictions of which he knows nothing. And he sees in those representative changes, changes of an internal kind, or as to his receptivity of divine life, and as a consequence of his recipiency, changes as to his mental affinities with others, and of others with himself. Thus, while he is beholding the outward glories of his heavenly world, his reason is tracing out the relative affinities of love and thought by which these living representations and the delights which terminate in the senses are produced, and to which they correspond. These perceptions of their interior causes and of their spiritual uses form the very staple of angelic thought, and are spontaneously and intuitively unfolded to the perception by an influx of life from the Lord, being different and yet harmoniously different in each, according to the form and the state of the mind that receives the influx. But by all they are known to be, and are thought of no otherwise than as being so many symbolic effects of the relationship of mental states in the universal human form of heaven. Into this, but according to the scope and determination of their minds, they have an insight more or less clear, by which they can trace the specific spheres of thought and of affection which have been the medium for their production.